Microsoft and Sony are hard at work developing the next generation consoles, the successor to the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 respectively. But we've also been hearing a lot of rumours that both the PS5 as well as Xbox will receive a mid-generation refresh. For example, the PS5 Pro would feature drastically beefed up specifications and launch somewhere in the neighbourhood of 2024. In this video though, I want to discuss Xbox SABIN, which is a very different approach for a mid-generation refresh. These rumours that I've been hearing are genuinely extremely exciting because yes, you do get a later graphics IP like RDNA 3, but critically, there were some genuinely very interesting innovations that Microsoft were working on for this console, and paints a very interesting picture of what we will see most likely for Sony as well as Microsoft going forward with, let's say, the PlayStation 6 and whatever the next generation Xbox are called. And we're going to get into all of this after this message from the video's sponsor.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
So we've known for some time that the PlayStation 6 as well as the next generation Xbox have been in development. Of course, it's pretty logical that this was going to occur anyway, but thanks to the whole Activision Xbox thing, well, both Sony have, of course, publicly announced that they are working on a PlayStation 6, and there's also been rumours that Mark Cerny will be involved in its development, but also Microsoft recently outed a project name for this next generation Xbox, although they redacted the name. Now this basically completely nukes the idea that Microsoft would be working on a streaming only future, and at the very least we will see at least one more physical hardware generation from the company. There's already been some reports that Mark Cerny will be involved, of course, in the PlayStation 6, and to my understanding, Sony are already going out, speaking to developers, and basically asking how can they improve the PS5. It's a very similar approach to what they did with, let's say, the PS4. They basically do a post-mortem after launch, and they say, hey, how do we improve the PS4, or how do we improve the PS5? What features did you like? Which issues and bottlenecks did you have? And of course, I suspect Microsoft are doing much the same thing, having those conversations with developers, because those sticking points with developers obviously mean that they can craft better products and more easily able to iterate on games and just basically give us gamers much better experiences. There are rumours for mid-generation refreshes and upgrades, but in this video I really want to focus on SABIN, a kind of refresh of sorts of the Xbox Series lineup of consoles, but SABIN isn't quite the beefed up Xbox Pro some of you may have imagined, but in some ways perhaps is more exciting because of the technology it represents. I was told about SABIN by a few sources, one of whom has been ultra reliable, and since then I've had additional details filled in. Now the original source told me of several upcoming AMD APUs, one of which seems to have been developed for Microsoft. As a bonus though, I'll also mention another APU, which is Sarlacc, an obvious reference to Star Wars. I don't believe though Sarlacc has anything to do with Xbox or even Sony, but from what I'm told it's an APU designed around the Zen 5 IP and a later generation of RDNA, possibly RDNA 3 Plus or RDNA 4. But again, let's circle back to Xbox and SABIN. SABIN, I think, is largely RDNA 3 based, potentially with some elements of RDNA 2 remaining in its design, although honestly this part hasn't been made 100% clear, largely though RDNA 3. But outside of the GPU, the APU itself sports numerous changes which make it stand out considerably over the OG releases. The CPU was also Zen 4 based, retaining the same 8-core configuration seen in the original series hardware, but of course Zen 4 is a big performance uplift versus Zen 2. This is achieved through numerous reasons, architectural improvements, higher clock frequencies, but I wasn't given the clock frequency target for SABIN. As I alluded to earlier, SABIN, which remember is likely just the codename of the APU, the console would probably have a different codename. it was not a pro console. Instead, in specifications, it was more aligned with the Xbox Series S. From my understanding, RAM saw a small uptick, raw T-flops saw an increase over the Series S. I was told it was meaningful but not close to the Series X. So why were Microsoft considering this, and more importantly, why is it even exciting? Well, there is a big difference between this system and the previous ones, not just the IP of the GPU, but there was a dedicated ML block, and to my understanding, this is not the same capabilities that were introduced into RDNA 3. For one, this is an entirely separate block, not necessarily a chip, but it's basically an area of the APU on the GPU itself, so it's an entirely separate area. And it was co-designed by Microsoft as well as AMD. So this means they are not relying on RDNA 3's CU for machine learning to run for upsampling and other uses, which I'll get into in just a moment. Now, for those who do not understand what RDNA 3 does for its ML, I'll give you a very basic overview. RDNA 3 doesn't work in the same way as NVIDIA's Tensor cores, much like RDNA 2. Instead, ML instructions are run on the shaders of the GPU. Now, very early on, there were reports that the AI cores were contained within the CU of RDNA 3, thanks to some official AMD slides, but honestly, this was not quite true. Instead, there are basically new functionality and instructions that the CU itself can handle, but AI still runs on the same shaders, albeit more efficiently and with additional support for instruction types. I'm glazing over a lot of technical details here for digestibility, but in the description I'll place some links to deeper articles if you'd like to know more. However, this is not really relevant to SABIN, because instead it has an ML block, which, as I said a moment ago, I believe is integrated into the GPU, which was literally designed, among other things, to take a lower resolution input and upscale it. According to a few sources, this was not just AMD designed, but Microsoft had heavy input into this. Remember, Microsoft have been working on ML for quite some time. Even before the Series X launched, we saw direct ML demos with Forza. Now, to be clear, this would mean that the performance of the GPU wasn't impacted at all. This whole process was also automatic, so it did not require, to my understanding, a developer to do anything. They didn't need to, say, implement the upscalers such as FSR. Temporal upscalers such as FSR2 are gaining a lot of popularity right now, and image quality is decent, but not perfect. NVIDIA's DLSS, which relies on Tensor cores, generally offers superior quality at lower resolutions. Now, my understanding, the specifications generally in terms of, say, compute are closer to the Series S, but again, it did feature more RAM, although I don't have the exact quantity. I don't think it actually been 100% nailed down, but the really interesting thing here is that pricing was going to be very similar to the Series S. That was the target. Basically, visuals, though, because of upsampling and other changes, would be very similar to the Series X. But ultimately, this was not really being designed as a replacement to the Series X. But I think Microsoft have put the project on hold, probably even cancelled it. And I do not believe that Microsoft are working on a pro console. I could be wrong, but to my understanding, I don't think they are. Now, why did they cancel this? Well, there were numerous reasons provided to me. Similar to the canning of the PS5 Pro, a lot of them were business decisions. The complexity of another SKU for developers to program for, the marketing efforts, and a number of other issues. Plus, of course, scalers such as FSR2 currently do exist, albeit this method is, from my understanding, superior to, say, FSR2. I also think that this project was cancelled very early. The features and rough performance targets had been decided, AMD were contacted, chip simulations had begun. Indeed, I've seen a couple of documents for that, although I can't show them unfortunately, but before Microsoft had made any actual prototype hardware or sent it out to developers. But the really exciting thing about SABIN, at least in my personal opinion, is that SABIN did have this chip, and it represents some incredibly interesting thoughts to what could happen to a next generation Xbox, and indeed also Sony. Curiously, there have been some rumours in the past that Microsoft are pushing AI into Windows 12. In fact, I'd also reported that from yet another source, the next generation Xbox, not SABIN, this would be an entirely new generation of console, likely released in 2027 or 2028, would feature tighter integration of AI. Curiously, this would involve things like better AI in games, characters, natural language communication, kind of like ChatGPT in some ways, and whether the SABIN chip itself could run this stuff, at least kind of in theory, I wasn't exactly told, but it does make logical sense, and besides, designs have evolved themselves. Now, how will this actually differ from later iterations of RDNA, such as RDNA 4? Now, it's too early to tell 100%. In recent interviews with 4Gamers, along with other publications, various engineers and management within AMD have hinted that they kind of wanted to go this route to a degree, with accelerators for game AI, for example. Frankly, there's a lot of pieces and moving parts here, and I think parts of this getting reused and enhanced for new consoles is hard to say. The early leaks I've been given about RDNA 4 also point to a new ground-up design, with multiple chiplet compute dies. RDNA 3 houses a single compute die known as the GCD. While GCDs 2 still exist technically with RDNA 4, the GCD itself is separated up to 3 GCXs, and each of these GCXs houses a number of CUs. Now, this could change prior to launch, but it is possible, of course, my info is wrong. However, it's worth noting that some of this information I've received are some of the very same sources that leaked me the configurations of RDNA 3 for Nave 31, 32, and 33, and so far that information has bared to be 100% accurate. Speaking of which though, a separate source has told me that the next generation of Xbox and PS5 will use RDNA 4 as its base, with some customizations of the graphics IP. Honestly though, I have to say I'm a bit skeptical about this information. RDNA 4 launches next year on the PC, assuming AMD's own roadmaps don't slip, and RDNA 5 will be about 2 years after that, which makes it 2026. Microsoft and Sony's consoles are expected to hit shelves 2027 to 2028, according to documents anyway. Now, assuming AMD haven't moved entirely away from this GPU architecture by then, I find it very unlikely that we're going to see these consoles sport anything less than RDNA 6. Microsoft, for example, seem to want feature parity between the latest RDNA version and Xbox hardware. So I don't see this happening because obviously porting games from the PC to Xbox and vice versa is a really big step for them in terms of like the SDKs and development process. And Sony, it's the same thing. Sony have always pushed towards the latest versions with lots of customization. The PS4 Pro, for example, when it launched, it was based on Polaris and Vega. Vega had not even been available for desktop at that point. So again, I don't think RDNA 4 is likely. I could be wrong. And also, when it comes to IP versions with graphics hardware and consoles, they kind of mean less anyway because you can just do shit tons of customization across the board. Now, I will say that at this stage I have no performance targets for the next generation consoles, and honestly I'd not be too hung up about this because there probably are multiple designs being worked on. There's generally like, and this is typical for Sony, Microsoft and other companies, there's generally like a couple of competing designs which are being, decided upon, and then once a design is decided upon, then it needs to undergo evaluation, and then, for example, there might be cost concerns or whatever, and maybe something could get cut down, maybe they might not hit the yields necessary, whatever. I'm vastly simplifying this stuff, by the way, so it's not 100% technically accurate, but I'm trying to give you guys a rough understanding how this stuff happens behind the scenes. So yeah, I think Microsoft and Sony are going to do a lot of custom work for, their respective consoles, assuming it is still AMD that are providing the hardware. It could be Nvidia, it could be Intel, it could be someone entirely different, but at this stage, I don't think it's very likely Microsoft, for example, are going to work with someone else. It's always possible. I'm sure these discussions happen all the time, but I'm not convinced. I think at this point, with the roadmaps that we've seen and with the conversations that we've seen publicly and the interviews and how, well received the consoles have been, I don't really think it's going to be possible. Now, I want to say up front, I still think Sony and Microsoft are now squarely focused on next generation hardware. I just want to mention this in this video because I'm still being asked about the PS5 Pro, because recently Tom Henderson put out a report. Now, I've covered this in a previous video, but what I want to say is that prior to Henderson's report, I'd actually put out a video myself, a couple of videos actually, regarding the PS5 Pro. Now, much of Henderson's info still seems to echo my own. I could be wrong about this, but I think the PS5 Pro is dead, much like SABIN. I would love to be wrong about this, because I'm a geek, and I just want to screw around with new toys, talk about their potential, but I feel that in present market conditions, and a number of other reasons, I think the PS5 Pro is likely cancelled. From what I was told, the PS5 Pro's cancellation actually happened at some point last year, possibly mid last year, but maybe a little later. I don't think development kits had taken any form of shape like the SABIN architecture, and it could be misinformation that the PS5 ever existed, although given the number of sources who told me this, and Henderson himself, who's had a great track record, I'm skeptical that Sony weren't at least considering it. It's possible that it is still in development, and therefore my newer information that it's cancelled is wrong. But yeah, ironically enough, a couple of the sources who told me it was being worked on are now telling me it's being cancelled. I'll give you a TLDR though on what I was told initially, but it's based on RDNA 3, a custom design. We've already seen some patents regarding this. I've discussed these ad nauseum. I don't think that these patents have anything to do with the PS5 based console. It doesn't make sense. The design looks much more in line with RDNA 3-ish. I think Alex Battaglia over Digital Foundry has also said this a couple of times in public. It doesn't look like the PS5. There have also been numerous other discussions from Sony which seem to indicate that they're working on advanced ray tracing technology, including upsampling, which doesn't really fit what the PS5 can do. But getting back to that, Zen 4, again, 8 cores. Performance was around 2 times. I don't know whether that's FP32, so the T-flops if you prefer, or raster performance, around 2.5 times in ray tracing. The targets were multi-bounce, ray tracing, high resolutions, but primarily it was designed as a premium VR experience for PSVR 2. Target release date was next year, likely later. Basically, the general IP seems very similar to what Microsoft were targeting with SABIN, but obviously the PS5 Pro was a lot more expensive a unit. I've heard actually this is one of the reasons it got canned, because it was probably going to cost several $100s. SABIN likely had kind of similar levels to the Xbox Series X, if this is true, but it was utilizing things like machine learning. For what it's worth, I think that this is going to be a very integral part to Sony as well. There have actually been some patents from Sony. You can dig around yourself for this, and they've been talking about improving AI for game characters and interactivity. There's a lot of, VR patents as well. So I think this is going to be a linchpin of the next generation experience. As I said earlier, ray tracing reconstruction has also been a big thing Sony have been discussing. So I think that machine learning of some description is going to be a really big deal for the next generation consoles. AI is like all you're hearing about right now. So it doesn't take that much of a leap of faith to say, well, it's probably going to be a big deal for the next generation consoles. So yeah, I think the PS6 and next generation Xbox will be where excitement begins again. I think it's far too early to talk about deep chats about specifications and performance targets. Frankly, I do not have any at the moment. At least anything that I'm actually confident in saying out loud. But let's be honest, guys, console manufacturing can't just, forever rise in price. As a general rule, for example, the die of the PS4 and PS5s are roughly the same size, at least at launch, but denser nodes, especially if you're on like a leading process, they have smaller yields, but obviously they do get better over time. Long story short, I don't think this is going to be like a case of more RAM, more T-flops, more CPU performance. Obviously, they will have more CPU performance and more RAM or whatever else, but I think that efficiency and utilizing performance and like specific accelerators and so on is going to be a really big part of the next generation experience. Think, for example, the PS5 and Xbox Series X. Ray tracing is really cool, it's allowing new experiences, but the SSD and high-performance CPUs basically enable developers to rethink how games are designed and engineered. So there you have it, guys. That's what I've heard regarding the Xbox SABIN. Or, again, just to be clear, SABIN is the APU name. I don't know what the actual Xbox project name is. It could be the same, it could be a little bit different. But I think it's going to be a very interesting future we see for Microsoft as well as Sony going forward. Genuinely, I feel that the PlayStation 6 and the next generation Xbox are going to represent a pretty big turning point in gaming. And if you were to do just kind of a look back at each generation, let's have the PlayStation because it makes it easier, like PS1, PS2 and PS3, since PlayStation 1 had that, kind of first leap into 3D graphics. I mean, technically there were other consoles which did 3D, but, let's just keep things simple here. The PS1 was the first foray into 3D graphics. Obviously, then you had PS2, which drastically improved the textures. We had somewhat decent lighting. We had much better geometry and so on and so on. Then we had, of course, the next generation consoles from Sony. And at this point, resolutions bumped up again as we were starting to enter the HD era. Again, lighting started to improve. But by the time we hit the PS4 era, there were much better lighting options available, like screen space reflections were not exactly uncommon. Again, resolutions went up. But there were, more importantly perhaps, huge gameplay innovations as developers were able to have a lot more RAM to play around with. And let's say with the next generation Xbox, for example, what could we see? What kind of awesome ideas could Microsoft and Sony incorporate in their system with much better AI? It's going to be very interesting, honestly, over the next couple of years to see what's going on. I don't know if you guys have witnessed the recent NVIDIA conference. Admittedly, that is focused on HPC, cloud, that type of stuff, but genuinely, there is some really cool stuff on the horizon, and it's going to be very interesting. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. There's going to be a couple of other very interesting exclusives which are going to pop up on the channel over the next couple of days, including a lot of graphic stuff. So do, of course, stick around with us for that. And if you've enjoyed the video, well, it's YouTube, you know what to do. Take care of yourselves, have an amazing day. Bye for now.